Hello and welcome to the Payne Institute Integrated Carbon Capture, Utilization and Storage Initiative podcast, or the CCUS podcast for short. I am Jordy of the Payne Institute of Public Policy at the Colorado School of Mines. On behalf of my colleague Laura Singer, I would like to welcome Charlie Berger from the Denver Beer Co. to discuss CCUS in the beer industry. Thanks for joining us, Charlie.
Thrilled to be here. Thanks, guys.
Great. So we're just learning about Denver Beer Co. Could you tell us a little bit more about it and maybe how you guys got started and where you're at now?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, first of all, the carbon capture industry is really such a cool thing. I'm excited to be here to specifically talk about that with you guys and our tiny little role in it. But the Denver Beer Company is a small local brewery. We started on Platt Street over by the big REI downtown Denver in 2011. Just as a little tasting room, tap room, we make 7-barrel small batches of beer on site and experimental varieties and traditional styles, and serve them in a fun open air beer garden that, in the pre-COVID days, we really served a lot of beer, packed a bunch of people in, and now we're making it through. I'm on the taproom side. We have another taproom in Old Town Arvada, also one soon to be open on South Downing Street. We're very excited about that big open airy beer garden as well on that spot. Additionally, and actually the majority of the beer we make at our production brewery, which is in the Sunnyside neighborhood of Denver. We put beer in 6-packs, 12-packs, and kegs that we sell to the local independent retailers and actually some of the chain, King Soopers and Safeways, and then Whole Foods out there. So we have beer in really just Colorado. So we sell a tiny bit of beer in Wyoming as well, but our volumes have been growing, and we really are focused on community sustainability, and that's kind of maybe a good jumping off point to the carbon capture project that we've launched recently.
That's awesome. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you first heard about capturing carbon?
I mean, as a brewery, a byproduct of what we make is CO2. CO2 is just naturally produced as the yeast metabolize the sugars from the malted barley, and as a byproduct produce both alcohol and CO2. The CO2 is traditionally in breweries our size, our scale, just kind of bubbled off to the atmosphere. That's a very common, normal practice. Now, it is true that the Anheuser-Busch's of the world and the really big breweries, they've realized that what they do is they bubble off all that CO2 gas, but they use a bunch of that same gas in their, process. Maybe it's purging tanks or purging lines or actually carbonating the beverage at the end, the beer at the end. So that's also true for us. We have, and all breweries do, usually buy a bunch of exogenous commercial gas. That commercial gas is a byproduct of oil and gas extraction and the normal places that CO2 comes from. Like I said, big breweries have found a way to recapture their gas from fermentation. And so I was always intrigued by that. It seems like a very full circle thing to be able to capture the gas that we create. And I was introduced to this as a realistic option for breweries our size by a company out of Austin, Texas called Earthly Labs. Earthly Labs developed a technology to make it affordable for breweries our size to actually capture, filter, and compress the gas into the liquid form that we need so that we can use it in our process. And we have purchased and installed one of their units. It's the size of like a commercial refrigerator, a small unit that sits in our brewery, and it runs and collects all the CO2. Not all, but most of the CO2 that we're creating for fermentation.
Yeah, that's super cool. And I guess one of our questions was going to be if you think other beer makers should adopt similar systems, but it sounds like that's kind of already happening, and the larger ones are doing it, and now you guys that are a little bit smaller can do it as well.
Yeah, one of the reasons that small brewers hadn't been doing it is because it's the installation that the Anheuser-Busch's have. It's probably a $10 million system just in their brewery, which is unaffordable, right? So it doesn't make economic sense for a brewery our size to do that kind of a system, of course. The Earthly Lab solution is very different. It's like it's affordable. There's a return on our investment. We're now buying less of the commercial gas that we were previously buying. we're saving the greenhouse gas from being emitted to the atmosphere. I can't wait to talk about all the benefits to us, but we'll get into more and more of those later. But yeah, it's an affordable solution. I hope that it's very accessible. Brewers have to put up a little money for the capital investment to put the system into place up front, but the return on our investment, we did the math, it was 2.5 or 3 years. So I've been advocating small breweries our size to jump on this bandwagon for sure.
That's awesome. I'm psyched also that you're so excited about it. So let's talk more about that system and how it works.
Totally. From a technical perspective, what it is basically the fermentations that we do are in a relatively closed system. The reason they're sort of a closed system is because we want our beer to be fermented by the very specific yeast strain that we pitch into it. We don't want like any other microbes or any other bacteria or any other wild yeasts in the tank. So there's really only one outlet, basically, at the top of the tank. When yeast start producing CO2, what's happening is they create a positive pressure environment inside the tank. And through the outlet, it's basically an arm that comes out the top of the tank and then down the side, and then off the arm is normally where it's just a hose vented through a sanitary bucket. It kind of bubbles out of that sanitary bucket to the atmosphere. What we do with the Earthly Labs system is we actually attach a hose there that goes through what's called a foam trap, because like all craft brewers, we're trying to maximize our efficiency in our fermentation tanks by filling them all the way up. And sometimes when that yeast is fermenting, inside the vessel is a lot of kind of what's called krausen. It's basically foam. And sometimes that foam can come up and out. So the reason we have our CO2 hose going out through a foam trap is because we want to stop the foam from getting past that one point into the system down the line a little bit further, the CO2 recovery system. Okay, so after the foam trap then is basically a filter. It's like a carbon filter that eliminates a lot of the impurities from the CO2 that's coming through. Again, we don't have a ton of impurities because our CO2 is not coming from like commercial oil and gas extraction. It's totally, I hesitate to use the word organic, but it's very natural CO2 coming right out of our tank. The dryer is the next step of the process. The CO2 gets totally dried out. That's important because we're going to then compress it. We don't want any water in with it. So we compress it into a liquid form and then put it into what's called a dewar, which is a vessel that can hold liquid CO2 at a high pressure, obviously. And then that's what we can use. So that high pressure liquid CO2 is what we use throughout our process later on.
That's awesome. I didn't realize it seems like relatively straightforward, but also a bit technical and cool, that it works out like that. And I think the idea of organic low carbon CO2 beer would be really cool. It's kind of a fun concept.
I think it's so super cool. Also, sorry to interrupt, that I didn't realize it was a byproduct as well as like an ingredient, because I know that it have bubbles in beer, but didn't realize that it was part of that fermentation process as well. That's super cool.
It's really interesting. All brewers use CO2 because beer is, it has a shelf life, right? And the shelf life, the reason it has a shelf life is, the flavor changes a little bit as it ages. One of the reasons that the flavor changes is because of dissolved oxygen. So anytime beer is exposed to oxygen, it has the ability to pick up even parts per billion. And that's what creates kind of a stale beer flavor, like cardboardy. So even in addition to using the CO2 as a carbonation ingredient at the end, we also use it as a process ingredient. We will flood the tanks that we need, that we're going to be transferring our beer into. We'll flood those tanks with CO2 in order to make sure that there's no oxygen in there that would later down the line stale our beer.
And you flood that's that liquid CO2 that you use?
Well, no, we flood it with the gas. It's liquid inside the dewar, and then we have a vaporizer, which helps to, as we pump it into the tank, it comes in the form of a gas. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
You mentioned earlier a bit about some of the positive things that have come from the system and from you guys implementing your own carbon capture. It seems like a lot of people in Colorado would like it, but you also said that, it's been cost effective. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Maybe some of the benefits you've had from this?
Yeah, it's well, number one, we tell the story, right? And you guys helping get the word out also matters a lot. But it's marketing in a way as well. We get to put on our packaging that our beer is, one of the first Colorado beers made with reclaimed CO2. Another benefit, which is pretty cool, is we have excess. We often collect more than we use. So we created a cool partnership with a local cannabis grow called The Clinic. They are, using CO2 in their grow rooms. And what they're doing is it actually helps them flower their cannabis, which is obviously an important part of their growing process. And so we actually sell some excess CO2 to The Clinic. And it's a cool way to do a collaboration between a brewery and another super highly regulated industry in the cannabis industry.
That is cool. I didn't realize that there's another Colorado industry making use of CO2.
They're making use of it. Totally. There's a lot of places that actually use CO2, but we're one of very few that has the, ability to actually reclaim CO2.
Who else is using it, out of curiosity? Sorry to go off on a tangent here.
Yeah, tons of CO2 gets used in every bar and restaurant uses CO2 to push the beer out of their keg to the draft system.
Huh.
There's tons of medical uses as well. CO2 is used as a cooling agent a lot to freeze things.
Cool.
I think it's great that you're telling our CCUS expert what CC or carbon is used for. It's a good sign.
Thanks, Jordy.
No, I was just joking, Charlie. That's a rib on Laura, not on you. I guess one of our last questions is, I guess it's a two-parter, since I was looking at your company website and it mentioned that you shave once a week, whether you need to or not. I think
love it.
It's interesting. And could you explain why? And then also, if there's a beer that you think we should try from you guys, we do a lot of events at School of Mines with some people that are interested in, carbon reduction. So I think if we get an endorsement from you of a good beer and we can tell them that it's low carbon, that we might be able to have more beer on campus.
I love it. Well, the Colorado lifestyle dictates my shaving schedule, which is, at the office, in the brewery, we have a lot of bearded guys. So, if my wife would let me, I'd shave less often. But, when push comes to shove, once a week seems like about all we can get away with. That's just a funny anecdotal website thing. We have some super fun beers. If you're a hoppy beer fan, I will definitely point you towards our Juicy Freak. It's really becoming a great seller. It's got a little of the haze to it, huge hop tropical aroma. It's in a yellow can, pretty available around Colorado. But, on a cold day today, my go-to is our graham cracker porter. It's like a good sort of chocolatey, biscuity backbone to it. That's my jam on a cold day like today. So.
No, it makes sense.
Sounds very tempting. I think maybe we should have done this recording with some brews in hand. Think that through next time.
We should have expensed it. Yeah, this is our mistake.
It's not too late.
Okay. Well, thanks for your time, Charlie. I don't have any more questions, or if you have anything else you want to add, or Charlie as well, if there's anything you think that the people at Mines or anybody else listening to this podcast might be curious about, we'd be happy for any closing comments.
Yeah, I think my closing comments are really just that it's hard to use the word aftermath, but as this pandemic has really pointed out, it's incredibly important as businesses have changed fundamentally that we rebuild, and we rebuild with a focus on sustainable practices, whether they be solar or carbon capture or all those things. Just intentionally using this transition moment as a way to be better coming out of it than we ever were going into it. So that's the way I view the opportunity that is ahead of us. So I'm encouraging everyone who's a listener to just take that intentional look at the things you do and the way you work, the contributions to your community, and just make sure that they're all in the right direction. Love
that. That's a great ending comment. And I think that Coloradans and people all over the country and even the world can really get behind an adult beverage that, is contributing towards solutions, and especially now as we hopefully are coming towards the end of this pandemic.
Hopefully. I hope so.
Yeah. All right. Well, great. Thanks for your time, Charlie. And thanks everyone who's listening. And please join us next time for the next podcast we have, and go visit Denver Beer Co. and comment on Charlie's